The Book of Nehemiah in the Hebrew Bible is largely in the form of a first-person memoir by Nehemiah, a Jewish cleric and high official in the Persian court, regarding the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile and the dedication of the city and its people to God's laws, the Torah. Since the 16th century, Nehemiah has usually been treated as a separate book in the Bible. Previously, it had been combined with the Book of Ezra, but in Latin Christian Bibles from the 13th century onwards, the Book of Ezra of the Vulgate was divided into two texts, called 1st and 2nd Ezra respectively. This division was canonized with the first printed Bibles in Hebrew and Latin. The Reformed Protestant translations of the Bible of the mid-16th century, produced in Geneva, such as the Geneva Bible, were the first to introduce the title Book of Nehemiah for the text previously called 2nd Ezra. The Historicity of Nehemiah, His Goals, and the Memoirs of Nehemiah have recently become highly controversial in biblical scholarship, with maximalists viewing them as a historical account and minimalists doubting whether Nehemiah ever existed. The events take place in the second half of the 5th century before Christ. Listed together with the Book of Ezra as Ezra-Nehemiah, it constitutes the final chapter in the historical narrative of the Hebrew Bible. The original core of the book, a first-person memoir, may have been combined with the core of the Book of Ezra around 400 before Christ. Further editing probably continued into the Hellenistic era. The book tells how Nehemiah, in the king's court in Susa, is informed that Jerusalem is without walls and decides to rebuild them. The king appoints him governor of Judah and he travels to Jerusalem. There he rebuilds the walls, despite the resistance of Israel's enemies, and reforms the community in accordance with the law of Moses. After 12 years in Jerusalem, he returns to Susa, but later visits Jerusalem again. He finds that the Israelites have turned away from their faith and taken non-Jewish wives, and he remains in Jerusalem to enforce the observance of the law. The book is set in the 5th century before Christ. Judea was one of several provinces within a larger satrapy, large administrative unit, within the Achaemenid Empire. The capital of the empire was Susa. Nehemiah was cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes I, an important official position. At his own request, Nehemiah was sent to Jerusalem as governor of Yud, the official Persian name for Judea. Jerusalem had been conquered and destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 before Christ, and Nehemiah found it still in ruins. His task was to rebuild the walls and repopulate the city. He faced opposition from three powerful neighbors, the Samaritans, the Ammonites, and the Arabs, as well as the city of Ashdod, but he succeeded in rebuilding the walls. He then purified the Jewish community by enforcing its separation from its neighbors and implementing the laws of Moses. The only Hebrew book, Ezra-Nehemiah, entitled Ezra, was translated into Greek around the middle of the 2nd century before Christ. A second, very different Greek translation was made shortly afterwards in the form of 1 Ezra, from which the works of Nehemiah are entirely absent, these sections being either omitted or rewritten as Ezra, and at first the early Christians considered this later translation to be their biblical Book of Ezra, as did the 1st century Jewish writer Flavius Josephus. From the 3rd century onwards, the Christian Old Testament in Greek supplemented the text of 1 Ezra with the older translation of Ezra and Nehemiah, calling the two books Ezra A and Ezra B respectively, and this usage was noted by the 3rd century Christian scholar Origen, who noted that the Hebrew book of Ezra could then be considered a double book. Jerome, writing in the early 5th century, noted that this duplication had since been adopted by Greek and Latin Christians. Jerome himself rejected the duplication in his translation of the Bible from Hebrew into Latin through the Vulgate, and consequently all early Vulgate manuscripts present Ezra and Nehemiah as one book, as do Bede's 8th century commentary and the 9th century Bibles of Alcuin and Theodulf of Orleans. However, sporadically from the 9th century onwards, Latin Bibles are found which separate the Ezra and Nehemiah parts of Ezra and Nehemiah as two separate books, then called the first and second books of Ezra, and this became standard in the Paris Bibles of the 13th century. It was not until 1516, in the first printed rabbinical Bible of Daniel Bomberg, that the division was introduced generally into Hebrew Bibles. In later medieval Christian commentaries, this book is called the second book of Ezra and never the book of Nehemiah, and quotations from this book are always introduced as Ezra says, and never as Nehemiah says. The combined book of Ezra and Nehemiah from the earliest Christian and Jewish period is known as Ezra and is probably attributed to Ezra himself. According to rabbinic tradition, however, Nehemiah is the true author, but he was forbidden to claim authorship because of his bad habit of belittling others. The Memorial of Nehemiah, chapters 1 to 7 and 11 to 13, may have circulated as a separate work before being combined with the material of Ezra to form Ezra Nehemiah. Determining the composition of the memorial depends on the dates of Nehemiah's mission. It is generally accepted that Artaxerxes is Artaxerxes I, there were two later kings of the same name, and that Nehemiah's first period in Jerusalem is therefore 445 to 433 before Christ. Given his return to Susa and his second trip to Jerusalem, the late 5th century before Christ is therefore the earliest possible date for the memorial. The memorial of Nehemiah is interrupted by chapters 8 to 10, which refer to Ezra. They are sometimes identified as a separate work, the Memorial of Ezra, but other scholars believe that the Memorial of Ezra was fabricated and heavily altered by later editors. The material from both Nehemiah and Ezra is combined with numerous lists, censuses, and other materials. The first edition of the combined collection of Ezra and Nehemiah may date from the early 4th century before Christ, with further editing continuing over the following centuries. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the Moses Film channel and give the video a thumbs up in support.